So there is no quota protection for bass. Any commercial vessel is quite at liberty to fish for them as much as they like, as long as they obey the rules, which is stay out of the bass nursery areas, and you've got a minimum size of 36 centimetres. After that, you can go fishing for them. So the EU Commission think the solution is a quota. But quotas are difficult. You know, you need to base them on science, and the science for bass isn't really adequate. The commercials would kick off that, as they did with cod, as we saw, we're not really included in that system, so are we going to carry on unaffected? And the quotas at the moment would lock in the large amount of landings that the French quite understandably make. You know, Britain is on the northern limit of bass's range, whereas they're very, very comfortable in the environments and water temperatures and whatnot around France. But a quota would be based on historic landings, which have historically been the lion's share to France. It would lock in France as the dominant commercial fisher. France would like a quota. All the other countries don't want one. They would like technical measures. And that's part of the reason why the EU have been deadlocked for the last year and a half, unable to do anything, because France can sit there and say, it's a quota, and everybody else doesn't want one, there isn't agreement, and the EU want complete consensus before they'll move. One of the points about the minimum landing size, and one of the reasons why we like it and have been pushing for it, is it impacts recreational and commercial sector equally. We're all subject to the minimum landing size. So if it needs to go up to help protect bass, we all contribute to helping that effort. Yeah, and I think that is a really good, powerful point. You know, we're not saying the recreational sector get off scot-free. We're saying we should all contribute to help. And the minimum landing size is the best method for actually everybody doing their bit. And at 48 centimetres or even 45, as I said, most of the fishery is going to be small inshore boats, the kind that the members of the public quite like, pretty fishing boats in Mevagissey and whatnot, usually fishing more sustainably than big trawlers. The fishery of the pre-spawning aggregations we'll talk about in a little bit, but that might be, I flagged that up to Richard Benyon, that might be the kind of thing, if he wants to help the little inshore fleet, he can do that by having a quota and giving it all to them. Be a bit radical. And ICs, in their latest advice, have completely agreed with us. You know, they've said, that's a quote, improvements to fishery selectivity are needed to allow more fish to spawn at least once before capture. Exactly what we've just been saying. And if you remember, or I don't know if you all know, the Angling Trust have got a campaign at the moment, Let Our Bass Breed, and generally let fish breed, all to do with getting minimum landing sizes for bass and for all the other fish that we love up above breeding size. You know, if we're going to have any of those stocks get better, we've got to allow them to breed and generate the next generations. So that ties in with a lot of what many people are saying. Exactly. Okay, so remember this is the presentation I gave to Richard Benyon. I think it's useful for points to what you might want to talk about with MPs, IFCAs, MEPs, members of the Welsh Assembly Government, if that's the right phrase. We're not reinventing the wheel. We're not coming up with brand new stuff that nobody's ever done, because we've got this fantastic example of what happens if a bass stock collapses and what you could do about it, and how wonderful you can make the recovery both for the fish and economically for local communities if you get it right. You probably all know the story of striped bass in the US. It did collapse. A moratorium on killing bass was brought in for a number of years, and after that very well thought through rigorous measures state by state with national governments overlaying them was brought in, and we ended up with the Southwick study. Southwick are a group of consultants in the States who are very good at looking at these kinds of things. They studied this and they concluded that the recreational industry around striped bass across only 10 states in the US was worth over $6 billion a year to those economies. I mean, it's absolutely staggering. One fish in 10 states, just guys with rods and lines, can be worth over $6 billion a year to those industries. And that's partly because we get the lion's share of the total allowable catch, the take, and the fishery is very well managed, and they love anglers over there because we take our money and spend it. But I did make the point, the Americans are very good at economics and they are very good at business, and wouldn't it be great if Britain was a little bit better and sharper on that? But it did take a crisis to get them there, and my point to Richard Benyon was, let's not wait until we've got the same crisis to actually do the right thing. But we've got a fabulous, fabulous example there of how you can actually manage a fishery for maximum economic value for all of you. But we've got an example close to home as well that I'm sure you're all aware of. In Southern Ireland, no commercial fishing, it's a recreational only fishery. I didn't push this particularly hard because I think the discussion we had earlier about trying to climb Mount Everest, the striped bass management approach is the one that I usually say, if anybody says, what do you want? Stock answer, striped bass management, please. And if you're not sure what that is, it's what happens in the northeast states of the USA, because it's brilliant. And in a way, that's all you need to say. You don't actually need to understand all those details. What do you want? Striped bass management, please. But it ties in with what we're saying about minimum landing size needs to be a strong component, I believe, of a comprehensive management plan for a fish like bass, probably for very many fish. And in the States, 28 inches, that's 70-something centimetres compared to our 36. But that's what you do if you want that $6 billion a year of economic value. Some of them have a maximum landing size as well, don't they?
Yes.
So the really big, highly fecund breeding females with the genes to be big go back. It's a great idea. Okay, so Southern Island bass, you know about that. So ice season and CFAS. We talked a little bit this morning about influencing and talking to CFAS. When I took on the role of heading up, I suppose, the restoration effort within bass, I used the Bass Angler Sport Fishing Society as a way to get in through the door and to get to talk to people, because Bass Angler Sport Fishing Society actually still carries weight in government in places like CFAS. Go back 10 years, we produced the Bass Management Plan. Peter knows far more than I do about this. Basically, at the request of government, we produced a Bass Management Plan. We were involved in various things. People that came before me, like Malcolm and many others, have had lots of conversations over the years with ministers. They know us. They know we know what we're talking about. They know how passionate we are about it, you know, and feeding into consultations, as I mentioned earlier, keeps our name in the frame. It's the thing that gets you invited to the angling summit. And then you use that. It was an angling summit 4 years ago that I went to with Ian. Wrote to the minister, wrote to Richard Benyon afterwards, saying what a wonderful speech and how fantastic he understands and blah blah blah. But by the way, bass, it's in terrible trouble. The evidence is clear. Blah blah. He wrote back, saying politician's answer. I wrote back, being a bit firmer. He said, spend some time with my officials. So set up a meeting with a senior civil servant in DEFRA on angling policy, who's still there, and she brought along the head bassman from CFAS, and I've been working with them or on them, I guess, for 3.5, 4 years now. And the CFAS man is co-author of the ICES report, and this is the third of 3 that they've produced, getting steadily more firm, with more evidence and more ability to actually make statements about what's needed. And that working with or working on officials, be they scientists or government, I like to think or hope will work and will bear fruit. I'll talk in a minute about what it does do. It's a little bit like, before they're going to walk the walk, you've got to get them talking the talk. Hopefully then we can keep pushing and turn talk into walk, into actual action. But this latest ICES advice from 2014, ICES, International Council for the Exploration of the Seas, it should really be exploitation, are the scientists that advise the EU and their member governments on fisheries matters, amongst other things. So they're the kind of official independent scientists telling governments what they really ought to do. And it said, and this is absolutely fantastic, on the basis of the MSY approach, total landings across both sectors should be no more than 1155 tonnes. So that's out of current landings recorded of 5,500+ tonnes between commercial and recreational sectors across sort of northern France, England, Ireland, Belgium, Holland, etc. An 80% cut in recorded landings. And there's two really, really strong points in there. 80%, it's a huge number. That's the real sit up and take an awful lot of notice number. I mean, the advice the year before was a 36% cut, and that actually prompted the EU to declare emergency measures were needed. Nothing's happened since, but 36% was enough for the EU to declare emergency measures are needed. It's now 80%. And MSY, maximum sustainable yield, that's really important as well and is new in this ICES advice on bass. And the reason it's very important is we, all the member states of the EU and the UK in particular, have got a legal obligation to ensure that fish stocks are not exploited beyond maximum sustainable yield. That legal obligation comes from a number of areas. It comes from us signing up to Rio Earth Summit type declarations on biodiversity and protecting the environment. We've said that we will deliver this. It also comes from, there's a but, which I'll come to in a minute. It also comes from something called the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, which is a bit of a right mouthful, came from the EU. It's now been written up into UK law. And the Marine Strategy Framework Directive is fantastic because it says legally all commercially exploited fish species, which will include bass, need to, there's a whole series of descriptors as to what they need to be. And one of them says they need to have an age and size population spread that is normal. And it actually says, i.e. characterised by an abundance of large, old individuals. Now, wouldn't we like a bass stock characterised by an abundance of larger, older fish? We really would. The governments have done a little bit of a shimmy on that and have said, well, that's really difficult to measure. We can't really measure that. So what we'll do is, because we've got these MSY obligations and everybody's working out what MSY means for different fish species, we will say that as long as the species is being fished at or no worse than MSY, then it must be complying with our legal obligation under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. So the UK government have given themselves this legal requirement. The get out is, it says by 2015, unless doing it that quickly would cause untold hardship to commercial fishermen and would be destroying livelihoods and all kinds of terrible things, in which case you have to get there at the very latest by 2020. But we've just seen there's only 400 boats in Britain landing more than £2,000 of bass on the boat a year. So, it's not going to do that much harm because it's such a small sector. The other point about MSY is that legal point. For the first time, it enables an organisation to sue a government or sue the EU for non-compliance with their own legislation. And I sit on the Southern IFCA, Tom here sits on the Eastern IFCA. We've both had our IFCA work dominated for the last year and a half on something called commercial fishing in European marine sites. And European marine sites are protected under another couple of EU directives. And that said they should be protected, and they hadn't been protected from commercial fishing. And a legal firm called Client Earth got together with the Marine Conservation Society, who you probably have heard of, and wrote to the government and said, you know, you're not in compliance with the law, here's the evidence, fix it or we'll sue you, basically. And the government have decided to take a new approach to commercial fishing in European marine sites in conjunction with Client Earth and the Marine Conservation Society to avoid being sued. The threat of being taken to court has forced really serious action from the UK government. They're making the IFCAs do it, but it's forced action because the directive gave an organisation the ability to threaten only with taking the UK government's court. And this, if you don't achieve 80% cut in landings, you're in breach of your MSY obligations. As far as I can see, and I've made it quite clear to government, that leaves them open to a legal challenge, and they really, really, really do not want that. And they know there are organisations, and there are organisations that I know, that will take them to court. So I think personally that's a bit of a game changer. It is so new and so powerful. A management plan is urgently needed to substantially reduce fishing mortality throughout the range of the stock. It's basically because we need to do something really quick now, but we also need a long-term management plan. The stock is likely to decline further in the short term. We'll see exactly why in a minute. So, but that's flagging it. No matter what you do, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And it's already so bad that we need an 80% cut. And another new and I think very significant point out of that advice, in the longer term, management of sea bass fisheries should take into account the objectives and the economic and social value of the commercial and recreational fisheries that share the resource, adopting a common methodological approach to estimate the value of each fishery. So that, I think that might be the first time that something so bold has said, not only are we a part of this game, and not only are we a stakeholder and need to be taken into account, but you've got to start looking at the economic values from us as well as from commercial fishing. It's something that I've been banging on about for 4 years now with DEFRA officials and CFAS, and making that case that we saw earlier, that we are easily the biggest economic value from bass in the UK. And if you look at striped bass in the States, you see how big it can be and how much more, you know, economic growth. It's what politicians crave for, isn't it? So, yeah, I think that was really, really good to see that. It puts us firmly in the driving seat. And there's other written evidence that I've got from George Eustace saying exactly the same. He wants us in the room taking part in these discussions about how we manage bass in the long term. And some CFAS evidence. I think you're probably all aware of the Solent Young Bass Survey. Bass are actually partially funding that to keep it going. It tracks the relative quantity of 2- and 3-year-old bass in the Solent system. It's been going since 1980 odd, so it's got a very long time series of data, so we can see how successful the recruitment has been. We can see into the future. We can see how many junior bass, juvenile bass there are that can come through into the adult stock. It's what enables them to say, you can be sure there's going to be decline before it gets better, because we know that there are very poor years at the moment waiting to come through into the adult stock. Okay, so really strong evidence. We'll actually have a little look in a minute at that IC's advice. Oh, here we go, in fact. So, Google it, you know, IC's Bass Advice, June 2014 or something. This is what you should find. So here's this bit about, you know, the opening. IC's advice is on the basis of the MSY approach, blah, blah, blah. We've seen that. If you go to the next page, I'm going to come over here, Mr. Cameraman. I don't know if you can all see it. These are really important bits of information for the people looking at this and saying, well, is there a problem or not? So you've got commercial landings up here, basically going up and up and up from the sort of mid-1980s, reflected here in commercial fishing mortality. This green line is where it should be for MSY, maximum sustainable yield, and you can see it keeps running above it. and is almost twice as high as it was not so long ago. Recruitment. So this is the number of juvenile bass that are ready to come into, that survive the first few years, to come into the adult stock. That's a great big peak there is 1989. If you looked at the Solent, there'd be a big peak here at about 1997 and a reasonable one at 2002. Not a lot since. These two bars here that are shaded dark are not actually based on any measurements at all. They've been put in there as a basic rough average of all those years. But we actually now know, because we've kept that Solent Young Bass survey going, and because we've partly funded it to happen last month, that we will get real measures of these, and they're down here on the kind of almost nothing scale from 2008 up to 2012. So very, very, very poor recruitment because of that issue of the very cold winters. What young bass are spawned, get into the nursery areas, the cold winters have been killing them off. And that all leads to this picture here, spawning stock biomass. That's the adult stock out there around the coast of northern France, of Britain, including Wales and Southern Ireland. Just go back a mo, Steve. So, and you can see it kind of fluctuates. You know, we've got a low here just at around 1990. As that 1989 year group kicks in, it starts to push the number of adults up. They get fished. You then get the 1997 group and the 2002 group. So it sort of hits a peak around 2010. But we know it's going to go down dramatically, because in 2010 we can already see we're getting these very poor recruitment years, we're getting really cold winters. It's going to go down dramatically because we can see not so many juveniles come through into adult stock and huge commercial fishing pressure. So even in 2010, that's what I told the minister would happen, and lo and behold, it's happening. So there are three lines representing sort of best case, worst case, likely case. You can see it's going down. Certainly got 2 more years of very few juveniles to come through into adults to push it down. That blue line is the MSY line, and if you can see it, it says 5,000 tonnes. 5,000 tonnes of adult bass. The commercial take each year is over 4,000 tonnes. Add in another 1,500 for recreational take. You've got over 5,000 tonnes a year are currently being taken out of adult bass. You know, we're at maybe 10,000 tonnes now. Another couple of years of nothing much coming through of adults and 5,000 tonnes being taken, and you're at zero. That's what faces this stock if we don't do anything. That's why 80% is there. It's such a huge cut, because you look at that, you factor in 2 more years, maybe even 3, of very poor numbers of adults coming into the adult stock. If you keep taking up 5,000 tonnes a year, and we've only got 10,000 tonnes now,